familiar faces, so welcome back. For those of you who weren't here for, not you, Billy, my name is Lady Katherine Coscombe. I am from the Shire of Rivendell, which is mundanely Youngstown, Ohio. Throw a rock, you hit Ethelmark. In my mundane life, I am actually a theater professor, but not a historian. I am a costume designer and do that as my day job. But in the SDA, I've been doing lots and lots of deep dives into theater history, and this class is kind of the result of an accident. I was building a big, giant link list of extant medieval and Renaissance scripts, and I discovered a little play called Arden of Faversham. And now I am so deep in this rabbit hole that other people have to come along with me. So if you're familiar at all with how we think about theater and how we think about the kind of big genres, we have comedy and we have tragedy. Right. And comedy typically deals with the lower and middle classes. It's not serious. Tragedy is reserved. Tragedy is reserved for heroes and demigods and kings. It's not for regular people. And historically, that's the practice, going back to ancient Greece. Tragedy is elevated. But in the late 16th century, in England, we see the emergence of the domestic tragedy. A tragedy which is being treated seriously, which is about average, everyday people. When we get into the 17th century Jacobean drama, we're going to see a lot of domestic tragedies, and these are going to be fictional stories. But the first domestic tragedies that we see are actually straight up ripped from the broadsides, super salacious, true crime drama. So the Elizabethans did Lifetime before Lifetime. And so that's really where this class kind of came from. And I was like, well, this is really cool. There's actually a lot of, there's actually records of a lot of these plays that happened. So I was like, okay, so true crime just sort of popped up. Where is this true crime coming from? And I speculate, and that's kind of where this is going, that the birth of true crime as a kind of play is tied into a sort of overall Tudor fascination with crime. And that fascination with crime is tied to technology, it is tied to the printing press, it is tied to the broadside. So if we are looking at what's kind of happening in England, we've got to go back a little bit. We have the invention of movable type, right? So in the 15th century, Gutenberg, you've got the printing press moving all throughout Germany and the Low Countries. All of a sudden, you can produce documents quickly and cheaply and in vast quantities. This is, of course, revolutionary for lots of reasons. And so in 1476, a guy named William Caxton of Kent, he lived in Bruges for a time. See, Belgium. Lived in Bruges for a time and brought the technology home to England. He set up the first press in Westminster in 1476. The first book known to be issued there was an edition of the Canterbury Tales by Chaucer. And his press was doing chivalric romances, all kinds of classical works, and English and Roman histories. By 1500, we've still only got about 5 printers in England. Yes, this is, technology, but still really expensive technology. It's not cheap to set up a press. There's also nothing like the modern concept of freedom of the press. The Crown is absolute authority on what is allowed to be printed. You don't print things that the Crown does not approve of. This ain't a democracy, buddy. So there's lots of proclamations coming out from Parliament and the Crown about what might be a seditious or heretical publication, particularly once the Reformation starts going, because both sides are printing pamphlets and flyers out the wazoo, raising the rabble, condemning all the, it is straight up a leaflet war going on. And so the Stationers' Company is established to keep a registry of everything that's printed, partially as an attempt to control.
No, I'm just intrigued.
So you've got, so everything's kind of going through the Stationers, Company. There are, by the way, secret presses for both the Protestants and for the Papists. So, and anti-monarchists. And there are secret presses, but illegal. In 1556, the Stationers tried to force the registration of all ballads. Somewhere between 2,000 were registered between 1556 and 1600. It is very likely that more than those 2,000 were actually printed versus how many were registered, because they didn't register everything. In 1586, because of all of the chaos and the Reformation and the secret presses and the Star Chamber actually restricted printing to London, with two exceptions. One press each at Oxford and the other at Cambridge. So we've got printing presses, mostly in London, and in London it's just easier to keep track of what's going on. But the nice side effect for us, as historians looking back, the Stationers are telling us all kinds of information that's happening. And one of the most popular things to print is what's called a broadside. And broadside is one sheet of paper. It's big. It's just printed on one side. Usually, and you've got movable press and woodcuts to illustrate it. And they're sold very cheaply. So they're not designed to really last. You buy the new broadside, you paste it up to the pub wall, and people can go and look at it and enjoy the broadside. And then it gets thrown away. How many people really save newspapers, right? So they're printed pretty cheaply. Originally on rag paper and then later on pulp paper, and typically cost between a half penny and 1 pence. So they're on cheap paper and they're sold cheaply. They are not valued. Guess what? Despite the fact that we know that thousands of broadsides were printed before 1600, we have very, very few of them which survive. I got to see some when I went to Edinburgh. Because the National Museum of Scotland has a huge broadsides collection. There's a couple of collections in the U.S. too. But anyway, so broadsides are hugely popular. But of course, the printers want to make money on their broadsides. And so, here's the thing. Salacious sells. Sensational sells. And so broadsides really quickly devolve into how can we move these papers? What is the most over-the-top, scandalous thing that's going to get people excited and get coins in hand? And so these very quickly devolve into functionally tabloids. And so crime is a huge deal in these. They love reporting crime. The other thing are scientific curiosities. So two-headed calf is born in Yorkshire, conjoined twins, stories of deformities are also, especially with woodcuts, are also really, really popular. And so the thing about these is you're trying to get these stories, right? And again, producing in huge numbers, over 400,000 being sold annually by the 1660s. Like, they're just moving. But they start pulling stories from all over. So if you think about it, if you live in York, you're not paying attention to what's happening in Wessex. You know, it's over there. Who really cares about what's happening in Gloucester if you're not in Gloucester? And if you're in London, that's just all out in the country. But with broadsides, because they're trying to get stories, all of a sudden, you're getting this news from all over the country being brought to London and printed. So all of a sudden, you're just getting tales of crime from everywhere, and tales of woe and tales of marvels from the entire country, and sometimes from across the channel too, because why not? And so all of a sudden, now you just got this huge increase in reporting on crime. And this is a pretty crime-ridden era. The murder rate in Tudor England is actually 5 times the current murder rate in America. So, like, people are solving disputes with knives, man. Like, they are throwing hands. Petty treason is all. I want to talk a little bit about petty treason, because there's murder, right? And so, if you and another guy, like 2 guys, have a dispute, right? And one guy, that's murder. Okay, that's fine. Tudor England is remarkably sexist. And so there is a very specific crime it's snapped. That's what this, okay. If you think about it, as ordained by God, just as you've got Jesus as the head of the church, the husband is the sovereign of the wife. So for a wife to kill her husband is worse than regular murder, because he is her God-ordained head. It is as bad as if a subject were to kill their king. Therefore, a very specific crime. If a wife were to murder her husband, this would be deemed petty treason. Big treason is for the king, but wife killing us, it's a little treason. And stories of petty treason, boy howdy, did they move the papers. So we see this real fascination with adultery, cuckoldry, and petty treason. So that, that is one of these things that is very often a subject of these. And crime stories are not just appearing in broadsides, they're also appearing in chapbooks, which are really cheaply made books, and you will see chapmen who will have baskets with their very cheap pulp books. You will sometimes see quartos and folios with crime stories, but you're seeing lots of chronicles about crime. Woodcuts that depict the crime. And since you've got all of these stories, all of this fascination, humans, being humans, take the thing they're interested in with and turn it into art. And one of the things we see is the emergence, not just of all of these stories and all of this artwork, but we see the emergence of a specific art form called the broadside ballad. And so in the broadside, they tell you about the crime, but they also basically write a big, macabre filk. So they would take a popular tune. They'd be like, to the tune of Fortune My Foe, here are all of the verses. And it would be, say, a murderess at the gallows singing about all of the terrible things she has done. And then that is your popular song. You know the tune. And so you hear all of these, really spectacular executions, papists doing terrible papist things. There are so many of these ballads. There is a great website called the English Broadside Ballad Archive, which is EBBA. I've got a link on the sources, but the English Broadside Ballad Archive is a fantastic resource if you're like, I want to learn a song about murder. That's period. But it has like a whole, you can sort it by date, it has, or by subject matter, but it usually has a facsimile of the broadside, usually a close-up of the woodcut. It often includes sheet music. It might also include a, hold this up, we'll see how it's working on the Wi-Fi in here. Okay. So you can even listen to a lot of them, which is, this is Alice singing about killing her husband. We're going to talk about Alice. It's like 14 minutes long. So yeah, if you were at all interested in broadsides or ballads, if you're like a bard and you're looking for some really cool, interesting stuff, I love that website. It is really amazing. So we've got these ballads. And it's in the 1590s that we then start to see not just ballads being told about crimes, then we start seeing plays. Bear in mind, an Elizabethan theater company might be doing as many as 16 new plays during the season. They are cranking stuff out. So you've got to find sources for that information. So we know that there's a lot of plays happening, and two of our really good sources for figuring out what plays are happening. One, we have the Stationer's Register. It's like, so-and-so printed a play. My other favorite source for finding out what the heck is going on in the 1590s is Philip Henslow, who kept a diary and would talk a lot about commissioned a play, borrowed a play, saw a play. So we get a lot of titles. One of the tough things about looking at this time period is we very often have a lot of titles. We don't always have a lot of plays. So we start to see references to plays and plays which are about this crime. And we might even find, very often we will find a reference to a play about a crime, and then we will find ballads which also reference the crime. And every so often, oh, God bless Holinshed, you might find a historian who talked about the crime if the crime was significant enough. Holinshed's great. Holinshed published this massive chronicle of the history of England. Shakespeare steals from it extensively because Lear's in there, Macker's is in there, all of his histories are in there. It's Alex Arden is in there. But so we do see reporting on these crimes other places. So you're finding this collection of these are the things that were sensational. And I mean, heaven knows we still turn crimes into movies, and sometimes it's just like books and movies. So we did, we're doing the same thing. People are people. But it can be really, really tricky because the authorship for these plays is also often disputed. A lot of these plays, we've got a title, but we might have no attributed author or multiple attributed authors. The Victorians in particular really like to pin Shakespeare's name to everything. So that apocrypha gets really large.
Basically, any 19th century source just disbelieve it.
Just yeah, do not trust the Victorians. They're very enthusiastic and sincere.
Not very scholarly.
They're not very scholarly. So one of the earliest of these plays that we see and we have a copy of. Sorry, I'm going to backtrack just because I want to bag on Billy a little bit. This has not been a kind day to him, for me. Talking about these ballads and the influence of these ballads, and playwrights are reading these ballads. I am just going to read you an excerpt from a broadside, and I had the date written down, but this does predate the specific reference. It is The Cuckold's Lamentation, being a tale of woe, telling how a lover was cuckolded by a woman's harlotry. This is a common theme. And how jealousy and revenge are the downfall of a man, to the tune of Soft But What Light may be printed. Soft but what light from yon window breaks in the east? Maybe she was quoting William. I have opinions. So yeah, there.
I have a question about this. Is this the full sheet,
There
or is
is-
that just a?
There is a full one. It's on EBBA too.
Okay.
I found that sucker on EBBA, and I don't know if I have that one specifically linked.
I can find it.
So yeah, we're going to talk about my favorite. Well, it's just a really good example. So we're going to talk about the play Arden of Faversham. And Arden of Faversham kind of does a lot of the stuff we're talking about with these plays. Because this was hardcore crime of the century. All right? And so this is in 1551, so we're with Edward. And the crime was in 1551. The play was printed anonymously in 3 quarto editions in 1592, 1599, and 1633. It was performed at some point probably after 1587, which would be the Holinshed's Chronicle, which included a full and massive account of this crime. And 1592 it was printed. So somewhere in that window, but we don't specifically know what company did it or exactly when it was produced. It did appear in 1656 in a catalog, an exact and perfect catalog of all plays that were ever printed, and was attributed there to Shakespeare. Modern scholars believe that it was most likely Thomas Kidd, with Shakespeare contributing significantly to Act 2. But again, that authorship is not well known, and it's kind of messy. So Arden of Faversham, so Thomas Arden was murdered in 1551. This was such a big deal that in Holinshed's mighty, multi-volume Chronicle of the History of England, he stopped talking about the affairs of kings and wars and the Protestant Reformation to go on for 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, printed this solid pages about one murder. And then he's like, okay, anyways, to return to where we left, and then goes on back to talking about actual affairs of state. But, so we know it was after the Holinshed. We have one extant ballad, the Lament of Alice Arden, which we heard a little snippet of. So the crime itself, Thomas Arden of Faversham Abbey was a wealthy guy that was buying up lots and lots of property. With the dissolution of the abbeys, when Henry's just like, all the monasteries, he bought up a bunch of church property. So he was super wealthy, kind of old, kind of had a stick on his butt. He had a young wife named Alice. Alice did not like Thomas. Alice was young, tall, and well-favored of shape and countenance. She begins an affair with a tailor named Richard Mosby. And they're going on with their affair, and then they decide, we're kind of tired of just living an affair. So they decide that they are going to kill Thomas Arden. All right? Alice decides she's just going to poison his porridge, right? Somebody keep track of this, by the way. Okay, so Alice poisons her husband's porridge. However, it tastes funny. So he spits it out and doesn't finish it. Okay, well, that didn't work. So Alice and Mosby decide they need to hire a professional. And so they track down one Black Will, to quote Holinshed, a murderer, and highwayman. And so they hire Black Will, and he's got a henchman basically named Shakebag. So they've got Black Will and Shakebag, and they have hired him to kill Alice's husband. So they go to do that, and they come up with the whole thing like a dude named Mr. Green who was on the bad side of a land deal. They get all of this stuff basically to go up, get the servant to leave the door unlocked. And then they're going to go up to the room where he's staying and they're going to murder him in his room. But the servant chickens out. The room is locked. They cannot kill him. So that's two. All right. So they're going to wait. Okay. Arden travels a lot. They're going to go to rain him down. And when Thomas Arden comes down past them on the road to rain him down, they're going to jump on him and kill him. However, as they're waiting, and Thomas Arden's coming along, a friend of his is also traveling on the road, says hello. They can't kill him because now there's a witness. So Thomas Arden goes off to dinner, and they're safe on their way. And they're like, okay. So next, Thomas Arden is going to be going to the Isle of Sheppey. So we're going to go there, and we're going to kill him on his way to the Isle of Sheppey. It's England. It's foggy. They got lost. So Alice is like, we cannot kill him on the road. This is not working. So instead, what they're going to do is they're going to go to the pub and they're going to flaunt their relationship in front of Thomas Arden. So Mosby and Alice are like flirting outrageously at the pub to spur him into a rage so that he will attack Mosby and then Mosby will kill him in the brawl, right? In self-defense. Yeah, no, Mosby gets injured and Arden wins the fight. Fine. So Alice somehow convinces Arden that this was all just a joke. It's a big misunderstanding. They thought it'd be a real laugh to pretend. So why don't we bring Mosby over to dinner to make peace? They stick Black Will and Shakebag in a closet. They get Mr. Green, the property guy, involved as part of the party. And they're going to distract Arden with a pre-dinner game of tables. So they're playing backgammon. And so on a signal, Black Will comes out from the wardrobe and covers his face with a napkin and then strangles him with a towel. Mosby hits him in the head with a tailor's iron and, for good measure, just to make sure, Alice stabs him, and I quote, 7 or 8 times.
He had it coming.
He does die!
Hey!
8 times the charm.
Yeah.
6 times. 6 times the charm. Yeah, this is just, I don't know, I just find this friend hilarious. So then they drop the body off in the barn, clean up the house, hide the bloody rags and the knife like in the pantry. Alice has a dinner party. Remember, he's invited over for dinner. Spends the dinner party going, oh, where is my husband? Oh, he should have been home by now. I'm so worried about my husband. Right? So has a big long party. No husband, because he is, of course, dead in the barn. Sends everybody home. And after everybody's home, they dress him in his night clothes and take his corpse out to the edge of the property by a back gate so that he can be found in the morning. They find him in the morning with the idea, of course, that he went out to investigate a sound or something and got stabbed by a rogue murderer. I mean, he did get stabbed by a rogue murderer.
Yeah.
Anyway,
Stabbed, strangled, and hit on the head by a rogue murderer.
Right? However, it had snowed. There were footprints that were really suspicious. and there weren't any knife holes in his nightgown. And then they took off his slippers, and this was apparently the truly indicting piece of evidence. When they took off his slippers, there were rushes stuck between his foot and his slipper, because you wouldn't keep a slipper on if you had a piece of brush like poking into your instep. So it did not take long to get Alice to confess to killing her husband. It took them a couple years to catch Black Will. Black Will, being a professional murderer, was able to, slip the gauntlet for a while. So surprising no one, everybody involved with this plot wound up getting executed. Alice was set on fire. Because remember, she did the petty treason. Everybody else pretty much got hung. So that's a much better way to die than being set on actual fire. So this is the kind of stuff that becomes the grit of these plays. You can imagine how, think about how violent and bloody and full of revenge an Elizabethan tragedy is. You're like, oh yeah, this is absolutely full of drama. So Alice, dies. Her maid also got set on fire. Because both of the women involved got set on fire. All of the men were hung. So this, as said, turns into a play sometime in the late 1580s, early 1590s. And it is one of our 3 extant true crime plays. One of our other extant true crime plays is one called A Warning to Fair Women. Again, this one is anonymous. It is likely a Thomas, either Thomas Kidd or Thomas Haywood. The crime itself was in 1573. It was performed in 1599 by the Chamberlain's Men, which is Shakespeare's company. It is pre-Hamlet. This one's really interesting, actually. It's a really interesting play. Because it actually harkens back really heavily to medieval morality plays, particularly with its use of allegorical characters. So it's got characters such as tragedy, murder, lust, chastity, mercy, right? So it's got all of these who are there to give lessons and talk about this. It also features a play within a play. And in this, there is a Norfolk woman who was moved to confess her husband's murder when sitting to behold a tragedy performed by travelers playing that way. So it's really interesting that this is like maybe a year before Hamlet when we're seeing some of these same elements. Once again, this crime is recorded in the Holinshed Chronicles. This one's a little shorter turnaround because it's 1573 to 1579. This tragedy is actually, the story is significantly less funny than my favorite murder. You've got George Saunders and his wife Anne Saunders. They married in 1560 and by 1573 had many children. They were by all accounts very happily married. But there's a guy named George Brown who saw Anne and became obsessed with her. There is no evidence in any way, shape, or form that Anne reciprocated or encouraged that interest. However, there's this other bitch named Anne Drury who basically convinced George that if yes, they are both George.
Two Anns, two Georges.
Yeah.
She convinced Brown.
Yeah, she convinced Brown that if he killed Saunders, he could marry Anne. So he does. He kills Saunders. The servant is grievously wounded, reports the murder. Brown hides and flees. Brown confesses to what he did. Drury is indicted as a conspirator. And Brown said that Anne was innocent. Anne was not involved. But Anne Drury's servants, trusty Roger. It's like, oh no, Anne Saunders is totally part of the plot.
Oh,
Both of the Annes, Drury and Saunders, were both convicted as accomplices. Saunders entirely on this very trustworthy, trusty Roger's word. She refused to confess. They sent a minister in to persuade her, and the minister is like, no, she is absolutely innocent. Begged Drury to take the blame, but no. He winds up in Newgate for saying that he was just trying, like, they accused him of having inappropriate feelings for Anne Saunders. So, like, the whole thing is just, so she dies, the minister who tried to save her dies. This play really takes on she was clearly part of the plot. So looking at it from the outside, the truth of it is really, really tragic. But again, we are looking at one of these salacious stories, because trust me, this was all over the place, because we've got, murder and adultery, and oh, was she in on it? Was she, so again, it moves papers, and then it's going to move tickets in the theater. We've got lots of titles for plays that were based on crimes. Some of the ones that we have are things like The Stepmother's Tragedy by Henry Chettle and Thomas Dekker, that may or may not be related to an earlier play called The Cruelty of a Stepmother in 1578. We do have surviving ballads about this crime, where a stepmother killed her stepkid. Like, it's all of these. Page of Plymouth was one that the Admiral's Men did, probably Ben Jonson and Thomas Dekker. We've got records. It's possibly one of the domestic tragedies they make fun of in Merry Wives of Windsor. Philip Henslow owned a copy, lent it out several times. We talk about it in his diary. There are 3 ballads about Page of Plymouth. We've got Thomas Mary or Beech's Tragedy. The crime was in 1594. We've got at least 5 ballads registered, but all of those ballads that were registered were lost. So it is possible that Two Lamentable Tragedies is also Beech's tragedy, because it is a 2-part tragedy. We've got a record of the tragedy of Thomas Mary, which might be Beech's tragedy in 1599, 60. These records are so messy. They really just are, and then they're missing. But we have things like when the stationer talks about the tragedy of Thomas Mary, a true discourse of a most cruel and barbarous murder committed by one Thomas Mary on the persons of Robert Beech and Thomas Winchester, his servant, on Friday night, the 23rd of August, being Bartholomew Eve, 1594, together with the orders of his array and execution. 1594, 1599. Oh, we're getting tighter. The last extant one is the Yorkshire tragedy. The Yorkshire tragedy, surprising no one, has been attributed to William Shakespeare. It is more likely to be by Thomas Middleton. This was performed by the King's Men sometime after 1605 and before 1608. It was published in 1608. It is, at 10 scenes, basically the shortest extant play from professional early modern theater. It may have been part of a longer 4-part play called All's One, or one of the 4 plays in one called a Yorkshire Tragedy, as played by the King's Majesty's Players. There's also a couple other plays based on the same crime. There's The Miseries of Enforced Marriage and The Town Fought, or Sir Timothy Tawdry. Enforced Marriage was 1607. Timothy Tawdry is Restoration. It's Aphra Van Aw, who is wonderful. She's post-period, but whatever, in 1676. And with this crime, there are ballads about this one too, as well as several chapbooks and tracts by Nathaniel Butter. But in Yorkshire, William Caverley basically had to break an engagement to marry his guardian's choice of bride. They didn't like each other. Cavalry was doing drink and gambling. He has huge debt, squanders his fortune, and in a rage, after learning he was bankrupt and losing his land, he attacks the bride that he was forced to marry and his son, William 4 and Walter 18 months, by stabbing them. He kills both his children. Philippa survives due to her corset, whose boning deflected the blade. Calvary continues murderously throughout the house, throwing a nursemaid down the stairs, ordering another servant to retrieve his youngest son, being in the care of a wet nurse miles from home. The servant did not obey, so he got on a horse to go do it himself. The youngest survived. He did not make it to his youngest son, so you know. He's captured, brought to trial, refused to plea, said he wanted to kill his children for the past 2 years because they weren't his. He's quite sure that she was cheating on him. He was executed by pressing. So again, you've got infanticide, you've got forced marriages. This is the kind of stuff that is going to inspire fun things. As we move from Elizabethan theater to Jacobean theater, what we start to see, even though all of these early ones are this true crime stuff, we start to see domestic tragedies that is very violent, very revenge-obsessed, things about middle-class or regular people, but now we start to get fictionalized ones. And so as we get into Jacobean and Caroline drama, you're actually going to see a bunch of domestic tragedies that are not based on true crimes. So you will still see some true crime ones. The tragedy of John Cox of Collimpton, 1599. The Admiral's men paid Houghton and Day for a Cox of Collimpton or Cox of Collinster play to move into the Fortune. We know that one was performed March 9, 1600 at the Rose. It was seen by Simon Fortune, who wrote about it. He talks about the crime. However, we don't know who Cox of Collimpton is. So we've got somebody who's familiar with the crime, but we don't have a lot of records on it. There are Coxes of Coylton in Devonshire. Cox of Coylton also apparently included a rampaging bear.
They had a bear.
Everything's better with a bear, you know?
This keeps coming up.
We've got, again, this is lost, the Bristol or Bristow tragedy with the Admiral's men bought, probably in 1602. Cutting Dick by Thomas Heywood. And Heywood's writing for both the Admiral's men and Worcester's men by 1602. We think Cutting Dick was probably for the Worcester's men at the Rose. And this one was called a topical play. Evidence suggests that the criminal had not actually been captured, but was not yet executed at the time that the play had its first performance. Will Kemp talked about Cutting Dick during his 9-day dance.
Was he cutting Dick because he cut purses or because he cut throats?
Evans, known as Cutting Dick, a notable robber in Wiltshire, is taken like to be hanged. And of course, because it's a nickname, it could be multiple highwaymen or scoundrels. However, in an act of the Privy Council for 16th November 1601, addresses a band of notorious thieves, where one of the criminals is listed as Cutting Dick, a.k.a. Richard Cook or Dick Cook. So, possibly. One of our later true, and this again is post-period because it gets messy, is The Witch of Edmonton, which is a play by William Raleigh, Thomas Dekker, and John Ford. And this one is a story of betrayal and deceit. The witch is based on Elizabeth Sawyer, who was hanged for witchcraft in 1621 after a witch hunt swept through the community. Clearly, we've got witches and hanging, right? And that play was performed within a few months of the actual event. Yeah, and so you're going to... As we look at the Jacobean stuff, Fletcher's Jeweler of Amsterdam, Webster's White Devil, and the Late Murder in Whitechapel, and Drew's Late Murder of the Son Upon the Mother are all, again, true crimes mixed in with all of their more fictional domestic tragedies. Whew. I felt like I was doing a sprint, but so yeah, it's a really kind of fun little subgenre that's poken up at the end of the Elizabethan Golden Age and into the Jacobean period. And I kind of love how we are seeing both songs and plays about crime, which is like just so much like people are people and people don't stop people. So questions.
Another.
So,
Yeah.
I really, Webster specifically. I'm thinking, would you call it Duchess of Malfi kind of a domestic tragedy in high life? Because there's a lot of really intimate stuff that happens in the play. They're talking about her pregnancy and her household accounts, and she eats apricots.
yeah, it very much, Duchess of Malfi, like, is still a little elevated,
Right.
but boy does it have the
Duchess.
same salacious quality that we see with these kind of lower plays. But these are, by all accounts, really, really popular. See, I really thought this kind of stuff was not a thing until like the Victorians and all the Grand Guignol and you know what I'm saying? But it's actually so much earlier than I thought it was. Broadsides and broadside ballads become incredibly popular and widespread in the 17th century. We've got really decent extant examples from later. We don't have lots from before 1600. It's just because of the nature of the medium. There are Glasgow, Edinburgh both have good collections. The Bodleian has a good one. Harvard has a very large collection of broadsides in the U.S. I linked on the I put out the full links on the handout, but if you do the QR code, that takes you to the document. Well, it takes you to the folder with all of my documents if you want to click the links. But you can get a ton of this stuff online. And another really cool place to like learn about plays is the Folger Library has a whole compendium of lost plays, and they kind of give us what information we have about it. But even with lost plays, we have lost plays within lost plays because a fire destroyed a couple of years of records from the Stationer's Registry. So there's huge gaps still there, which is really a shame about how much we've lost. I did link the extant plays that are online. So if you want to like read the scripts, Penguin has like all like little Penguin classics of all of these. They're real cheap. Like I got most of them for like $6 on Amazon. If you prefer physical copies for these things, but they're fun. Yeah, most of what I had. I think I was worried about running out of time, so I just sprinted.
So,
Yes.